Hey there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video on Blazor Server authentication. And in this one, we will look into why you are actually using the authentication state provider service totally wrong. And we will also, of course, look into how we can fix that very quick. And there are actually two different reasons why you might be using the authentication state provider service wrong. The first one is because you probably use it in a way that it actually doesn't notify all other components if something changes in the authentication state. And that's really bad because you check something in your component, but if the authentication state changed in the meantime, you want to actually notify also other components or notify actually the authorized view component that might be reused throughout your entire application that something has changed in your Blazor server application. So that is really important, because otherwise, yeah, the other parts of the application will behave like everything's fine and nothing has changed in the authentication state at all. And that's of course something that we want to avoid. And the second reason why you might probably use this authentication state provider service wrong is because you might actually use it in a way that actually doesn't take into consideration what happens if a certain user logs out maybe in a different session. Then your current session might be actually not know about that at all. So we will actually look into those two main ways in which you most probably already used the authentication state provider wrong. And the reason why I said it is not that I know better, because until I guess 4 months or 6 months back, I was also using the authentication state provider service wrong. But then I ran into some problems with or in some of my applications, and then of course I have researched this a lot more and I found out how we can actually use it better. I will not say right now that this is actually the absolutely best way possible, but according to the research that I have done and I have put some real time in it, I think it's the best solution to actually use the authentication state provider service the right way for now. Okay, so let's get started with the first scenario. And in order to keep this video as short as possible, I have already done some changes here to actually get started very fast. So we are here in our index component. And remember that last time out, we have actually implemented here in authorized. We just wanted to say hello to the user in a very, I would say, personalized way, because we use the user's name here. But what I have also added is, let's assume that we might even want actually to display a custom weather forecast that might be based here on the user that is currently logged in. So that's why I have actually taken the table that we have in the fetch data component and also used it here. So from a view perspective, that's actually all. Just when if you want to actually do the same, you can just here copy this entire table thing. Now go to the index page, and here in this authorized view, right below this greeting line where we have a personalized greeting, we can just paste everything that actually that table should contain. And for not authorized, we have provided a different message. We cannot provide you with a personalized forecast as you are not logged in, of course, so we can't really do that. And here comes really the fun part, because here is the way that you might normally do that. So right now, actually, of course, if we look into this code, well, we have this override of the onInitialized async method. And here, the first thing that we do is we get the authentication state of the user. And for that, we have injected the authentication state provider. We have also injected the weather forecast service that comes by default with this Blazor server template that we have started from scratch with. So all the services should already be there. And once again, this is how you usually do it, because I have seen a lot of applications and both I was using this way, like just injecting the authentication state provider and then getting the authentication state, and then we get the user. Now, the only thing is that we do check here, if the user is authenticated, then we just get the first forecast that we might get from the forecast service. So it's not really, from the logic perspective, it's not really something very that binds actually the authentication state to what we do. But the idea, I guess you can get it. You can have here whatever logic you want that you might actually want to base on the fact that if the user is authenticated or not. You might want to redirect login, or you might, I don't know, get some additional data from the database to display on your component. I guess you might be creative enough to imagine, or probably if you worked with Blazor Server, you already were, or certainly were in scenarios where, well, if the user is authenticated, or if the user has certain claims or things like that, then you might want to perform a certain logic. And that's how you would normally do that, because in most of the tutorials, actually, it is this way. Just get the authentication state and, well, do your logic. The only problem with this is that is actually wrong, or this is the wrong way to do that. Because what happens here is you get the authentication state, and what happens right now when you actually execute this task is that it will check if the authentication state, or it will check the authentication state of the user. Now let's assume that from the previous check to this check, maybe the authentication state has changed, and no other component has actually been rendered so that the application is aware of that stage, of that change. Now the problem is you will have here the updated authentication state, but all other components in your app will actually have the old authentication state. And when I think about it, I think first of all about this authorized view component, which actually relies on this authentication state to actually define if we should display this or if we should display that. So everywhere in your code, in your Blazor Server app, where you have this authorized view, it actually relies on the authentication state. Now, once again, if we take a look here, let me just go here on the Authentication State Provider, and let's just navigate here to see exactly what this Authentication State Provider class contains, and then we will understand better. Now, the thing is that it actually, what happens here is that if we simply just inject the service, we actually use this get authentication state async task, which by itself, it actually just performs the fact that it actually gets the state of the authentication. But we see here that here we have also an authentication state change handler, and we have this notify authentication state change. So what it means is that in a regular or in the normal setup of the authentication state provider service, when something changes to the authentication state, actually this event is triggered that the authentication state changed, and then also this notified authentication state change is also triggered, and all the subscribers actually to our authentication state provider will then know in that second actually that something has changed in the authentication state. The problem is if you inject the service and simply call this method like we do it right now, nothing else happens. So this state changed event handler doesn't really trigger, and no component is actually notified about or is not notified about this change if we do it this way. So let's actually correct this and implement this idea the good way, so that we can make sure that if something has changed in the authentication state, all other authorized view components and other components that we might use are notified about this change in our authentication state. So let's go back for this here in our index component, and actually implementing this the right way is very, very easy. The only thing is that instead of actually injecting the service, which you should not do at all, we can just use a cascading parameter for that. And let's create first the parameter, and it would be a public task of authentication state. And let's call this authentication state task, okay? And of course that would need to have a get and set. So I'm not sure what happened here with IntelliSense, but it did get everything wrong. So right now, after we have this one, the only thing that we need to do is decorate this with the attribute cascading parameter. And what we'll actually do here in this case is that when our component will get rendered here, and it will actually happen that this authentication state task itself would be actually provided to us here or cascaded to us in an incoming parameter to our component. And in that case, getting the authentication state is actually as easy as authentication state task as actually executing this task. And now Visual Studio plays really crazy once again. Yeah, so we just want to await that. It still gets a lot of errors here every time that something happens here, but yeah. So right now we have this auth state, which should actually do exactly the same thing that we have done before, but this time actually it will also notify all components if something has changed in the state of our authentication. Okay, so let's run the application and actually see that everything works correctly with this kind of setup. We can even, for instance, right now here, come and remove here this inject because we are not using this authentication state provider anymore. We are just using here this cascading parameter that will be provided to us, and we'll just execute this task and everything should be fine. So let's run the application right now. And it will take probably just a few seconds until it will open the browser window, and I will have to bring it on this other screen most probably. So yeah, indeed we have it here. And right now we are not authenticated at all. So let's click here on this login button, and this will take us to the login page. So we will use user.example.com, and we know that we already have this user in the database. And let's here call this password, and everything should be fine. So right now we are redirected here, and we can already see that it works. So our service worked. It means that we did actually get user, and since the authentication state was correct, we also get this type of information. So this is, once again, as a summary for this first part, how you actually need to use this authentication state provider service the right way, not by injecting the authentication state provider and actually running this get authentication state, but by actually cascading a parameter that you would have to actually get in your Blazor component and then just execute that task. And that will also make sure that if something has changed in the authentication state from a previous check, it will also notify all your other Blazor server components, and that would ensure that all your entire application will be on the same page when it comes of changes that might happen in your authentication state. So that is actually, that covers the most part. And to be honest, this is probably in actually maybe 80% of all the Blazor server applications that I have seen, actually also on GitHub, but also working, they were doing it totally wrong because we were injecting the authentication service. And once again, even I did it the same until 4 or 5 months back, when I actually realized that this is not the best way to do that, and instead we should use this cascading parameter and not the injected authentication state. Cool, so we are covered with that. Let's now go to the second part of our test, and for that, to just show you what actually the problem might be here, is I will run this application once again, and I will bring you here the browser on this other screen, and let's take a look at a few points that we might have here. So right now we are authenticated because we have authenticated previously. So it means that we are able to also see the counter, and we also see the home page, and we have also the fetch data component. So everything is okay. Now let me just copy this URL and actually open another browser tab. And of course, right now we have the same type of the application and everything works fine. However, let's assume here that we just log out. So after we have logged out, of course, here we don't see our personalized greeting and weather forecast anymore. We can see, of course, that we don't have the fetch data component anymore because we have actually put it in an authorized view in the menu, so we don't see that. And if we click on the counter, we also see this information that you are not authenticated to view this content. However, if we go to this other tab of the application, the problem is here, if I go on counter, I can still use the counter. If I go on fetch data, I can still see and fetch the data, and I see the fetch data menu. So this already means that actually in another session, we did log out, But in this session, as the circuit was not refreshed, actually I still have access to everything. And the reason why that happens is that the authentication state provider by default works in a way that when the circuit is created, it actually gets the authentication state based on the HTTP context user. Now, the only problem here is that this happens once when the circuit gets created. Now, if the page is not reloaded, I am in the same circuit. So right now, the authentication state provider that is actually used in this specific circuit doesn't really know that something has changed maybe on a different circuit, because we might have, as said, two different browser windows opens, but there might be other scenarios where this authentication can change. Now, maybe the user is logged in, maybe also on another device or things similar to that. So that can happen. Now, the only problem as we see here is the authentication provider doesn't really know that something changed that. And this is actually a very, very bad security concern. So let's also have a fix for that. And in order to fix that, we'll actually have to create a new class, and we'll add here a new folder, and we'll call this new folder, we'll call this services. And in this services, let's call this, let's add a new class. And in this class, or we will call this class identity validation provider. So we have this brand new class here. And there is some code that needs to be written here. So I will probably just copy it over to make things short and just explain then what happens in this code. First of all, we need to make this be a generic one, so that we have to specify a T user, so which is exactly the user type for which we want to do stuff here. And also we have to inherit here from this class, which is the Revalidating Server Authentication State Provider. Now, due to the fact that we have inherited that, there is a bunch of code that we actually need to implement. And I will go through that. Just 1 second. I will copy everything that I have already prepared for this, and we'll go through all the steps here one by one. So let me just copy this here and bring it over here. And right now, I guess, of course, we need to do some imports like the ASP.NET Core identity and security claims and the authentication state. That's also something that needs to be imported from the Microsoft ASP.NET Core components, and the I options. And right now, we are actually done. Cool. So we don't have any errors anymore. Now, let's look exactly into what happens here, and I will go through everything here one by one. Now, in the first part here, of course, there's nothing really specific. Or let's maybe start here from scratch. We inherit this validating server authentication state provider. Now, what's actually this thing here? Now, when it comes to Blazor Server, but that's actually also available in Blazor WebAssembly, but the mechanism there is totally different, and we'll probably go to on a series with authentication in Blazor WebAssembly. But for now, let's try to concentrate on this idea of implementing authentication the right way in a Blazor Server app. So what we have here is the authentication state provider class that we have actually looked into previously is, as we have seen, a very, or it is actually an abstract class that it provides some very basic behavior, like getting the authentication state and also notifying subscribers when something changes in the authentication state. Now, of course, that class needs to be implemented, and for Blazor Server, we have this server authentication state provider class. So there is a class that's called server authentication state provider. And that class is actually the implementation of the authentication state provider, and it is the Blazor Server app specific implementation for that. And in that implementation, we actually use, or that implementation uses the HTTP context user property to actually check the authentication state of the user. So this is actually how the authentication state provider works in Blazor Server, because it has an implementation that implements this exact idea of actually looking into the HTTP context user and getting the information from there. However, the problem is, as said, that implementation, what it actually does, it only does this when the circuit is established. And then the authentication state actually will remain the same if it changes on another session, but in the current circuit, it will remain the same until we reload the page, because that happens only once, because that is the only moment when we actually can talk to the HTTP context in a Blazor Server application and be sure that we have a valid HTTP context there. And the reason why this happens, we covered in other videos, like how to use the HTTP context in Blazor Server apps, and there is a link to that video in the description, and there is a card here somewhere on the screen, so you might want to pause and click on that, because really we do explain that there very, very deeply, and using breakpoints and understanding how the application works and why we actually can use reliably the HTTP context only once. So of course that implementation has that specific problem. Now, therefore, there is another class that inherits the server authentication state provider, that in turn inherits the authentication state provider, and that class is called Revalidating Server Authentication State Provider. And what this actually is of course an implementation of the server authentication state provider, but with the option to have this task of bool method validate authentication state async. So it's just another implementation that actually allows us to periodically check if maybe something has changed in the authentication state. So that's actually why we inherit this Revalidating Server Authentication State Provider, because that has all the implementation of the authentication state provider for Blazor Server, but we can override or we can actually additionally tell that we already have a method to from time to time check if this validation is okay, or if the authentication state is actually up to date. Now, of course, in order to do that, we are right now tied actually to Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity, because this is what we will, or what we are using. Like 80% maybe of the Blazor applications that you might write will simply reuse Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity, because it is secure, it implements already a lot of security features. But of course, if you want, you can implement your own, but that's a discussion for a different video. However, the idea is that what we do here, we rely on these services here. Actually, this is the service scope factory, because we want to make sure that we get a scoped instance of the user manager service. Okay, we have also here the iLogger factory. And yeah, we just provide it to the base, and we need some identity options. So that's also, this identity options is also part of Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity, and it is added by default when you add Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity using the options pattern. So that is why here in this constructor, we can simply assign this value. So for the scope factory, we will get this injected, and for the iOptions, we can get this value. So that's what we do in the constructor of this class. Now let's move over to this other part. Now this revalidating server authentication state provider makes us to actually implement two things. First of all, we need to provide a time span that is actually the revalidation interval. This is the interval in which actually it will periodically check if the authentication state has changed. And we have set right now this interval to be 30 seconds. That's convenient for us here to also showcase how this actually will work at the end, but you can use here whatever value you want. You can even have from minutes and say it will be 30 minutes. So that really depends on how you want to set that those things up. Now, then we have this other method, protected override async task of validate authentication state async. And that is also a method that we have to override from the revalidating server authentication state provider class from which we inherit. And what we do here is, as we have said, we create a scope, and in this scope we resolve this user manager, because that is added by Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity as a scope service. Now the problem here is, when we want to use scope services in our components, the best way is to create our own scope that should be as short-lived as possible. So what we do here is we just get this service. And then we call a private method that we will look into just in a few seconds. And finally, we just return this private method that will return in the end true or false. And in this finally, we just make sure that we actually want to dispose the scope that we have previously created. So that's a very, very simple implementation of that. And right now, this private method validate security stamp async. Now that is really, as I said, very, very specific to this Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity implementation. But the idea is that we get this user manager as an incoming parameter, and we get the claims principal. And based on that, we can do some checks here. And of course, first of all, we want to get user from the database. And that's why we have this user manager, get user async, and we can then use this principal, which is fine. So if the user is null, well, then of course we have to return false because, well, we can't really do that. Now we have an else if here, and the reason why we have this else if, because we use here as a mechanism to actually check if the user authentication is still valid, we use the security timestamp. And of course, for that, we need to support the use of security timestamps. Now, by default, Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity supports this without any further configuration by just adding that, like we have done in the first video in this series where we have actually implemented authentication from scratch. So, but if it is not supported, well, then we will return true because we don't really know exactly what to return. And else, so if we support the security timestamp and if this user is not null, then what we do here is, okay, we just have to compare the principal that we have in our application with the user that we have in the database and actually compare their security timestamps. And you see that here we get the timestamp from the principal that's currently in the application or in the authentication state provider. And we also get the security stamp of the user that we got from the database. And we just compare them. And if these two security timestamps are not equal, then, well, of course, we'll actually have to simply say that the authentication state has changed. So the user is not authenticated anymore. So this is actually what we do here in this class that we have called Identity Validation Provider, and that inherits once again the Revalidating Server Authentication State Provider. Cool. Now, of course, in order to showcase this, we actually need to do just a few more stuff. So first of all, we need to register our service in our program.ts, because we need to actually register this custom implementation of our authentication state provider service. So we'll have here builder.services, and we'll add this as scoped, of course, because we want to create a scope for that, and authentication state provider. So this is, let's say, the kind of like the interface, because it's an abstract class. And then the implementation, okay, using Microsoft, that's what we want to do. And we will have here our identity validation provider of identity user. Okay, and here we'll have to also add some musings, like for the service. And right now, actually, theoretically, everything should be okay. I'm not really sure what happens here. Maybe I have a typo somewhere. And scoped. Sorry, no, that it's okay. So that was totally wrong. I guess that was a problem due to IntelliSense, because these are generic type parameters. So it should be something like that. But then we have here authentication state provider. Okay, is a type which is not valid in the current. Okay, I'm a little bit confused right now. Okay, let me just check this once again and I will be back very shortly. Okay, so yeah, I guess it's very hard to see typos when actually also recording, but the problem was that we were missing here then this closing angle bracket. And right now everything should be fine with that. But now there is one other thing that we actually need to make sure that happens, and that's actually on our logout component. And let's go here to our areas, identity, pages, account, and let's go to our logout component. Because what we do right now is that, well, when we actually do the logout, we just do the logout, but we don't update the security stamp. So what we need to do here is inject the user manager service. And if the user is signed in and we also want to do the sign out, we want to also update the security stamp for that. So in that case, we will just find the user or the identity and we'll say the user manager should then update the security stamp async. And now I guess we are ready to try this again and show you that our security vulnerabilities from which we have actually started are actually now resolved, because each 30 seconds, our custom implementation of the authentication or the revalidating server authentication state provider will check if the security stamp is still the same, so if the user is actually still authenticated or not. So let's first log in, of course, in order to do that. So we have user.example.com and we have this password here. So let's just log in and we will do exactly the same setup that we also had previously. So right now we are logged in. So let's just copy this URL and let's open another session that will open a totally different circuit in our Blazor server application. So even here we are logged in with the same user. These are two different circuits. So they are actually two different ways. In memory of the Blazor server application, there are two totally separated scopes and scopes for actually where that server application works. So right now, once again, we have everything here like the home, like the fetch data, and we are on this other tab, like where we also have everything. So let's log out of here. So we did log out of here. Now, I'm not sure exactly when the last check was made, but if we just wait a few seconds here, most probably we shouldn't be actually able to see these type of things anymore. And let's just wait one or just a little bit more, and we'll check. And you see, right now everything has changed. So right now it happened that our 30 seconds has passed. Then our authentication state provider that we have extended actually to use this revalidating identity state provider to actually check if that authentication state is still valid. And right now it actually found out that it is not valid. So what it did in this case, it notified all the components that the authentication state has changed. And right now we are actually also logged out from here. So that's, you see, that's how actually this idea of verifying or periodically verifying is the authentication state is still is actually still actual is very, very important, because otherwise you can have a very, very big security problems if user logs in from a device. But if he concurrently had another instance running on a different device, and if you don't use this revalidating state of the authentication, then your application will not know that something has changed there. And once again, in this identity validation provider, here you can provide your custom logic. Right now we have relied on Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity. You can provide your custom logic to actually find out if the authentication state of the user is actually the same or it has changed. You could even use another database provider like MongoDB, and you store your MongoDB or you store your authentication information from the user in MongoDB. Sure, no problem. You can implement here, you can inject your own services and implement your own logic and just return a true or a false. True means, of course, that the authentication state is still the same. False would mean that, of course, the authentication state has changed. So that's actually very, very easy to extend your application with, and it will boost the security of your Blazor server application. So this being said, that's actually it for this one, and I guess that we managed here in this video to show how we should use the authentication state provider service the right way, and we have looked into two very important things. So the first thing that we have looked into is how do we actually check in our components if a user is authenticated or not, and implement maybe some custom logic based on that. And there we have seen that instead of injecting the authentication state provider service that actually doesn't notify anybody else if something changes in the authentication state, we should use this cascading parameter. And when we execute the task, if something changes, then the authentication state provider will also notify all other consumers or subscribers that the state of the authentication has changed. So this is a very, very important thing. And first key point, don't inject the authentication state provider, use a cascading parameter that will actually provide you with the authentication state task. And the second part, which has a more security concerned part, is that by default, if you actually don't configure anything, if you have different sessions running on different devices or even on the same device, and if you log out from one device or from one session, then the other session will still actually be or remain available, because as said, the authentication state of the user is retrieved once when the application is bootstrapped, and it is retrieved from the HTTP context.user property, and it will actually stay the same throughout the entire lifetime of the Blazor application or of that circuit that was created in that specific point. So then whenever you will check if the authentication state has changed, you will actually get the same state that was actually provided when the Blazor application circuit was bootstrapped for the first time. Now, in order to resolve that, we have implemented a custom implementation of this authentication state provider that actually implements only this revalidating server authentication state provider. Why we do that is because this class actually already implements getting the authentication state in a Blazor server application, but it also provides us with a mechanism to periodically actually check, in our case each 30 seconds, if the authentication state has changed or not. And the way we do that is by checking actually in the database if the security timestamps of the currently principal that we have in the authentication state is the same as the security stamp of the user that is stored in a database. And to make sure that this is accurate, we have actually in the logout component, we have also made sure that we update the security timestamp of the user once we log the user out, because that will update the user in the database. And this makes it possible for our service that when it checks this in the database, like getting the user, it will already get user with the updated security timestamp that it was performed when actually the user logged out from any other session or device. And this will make sure and ensure that after these 30 seconds pass, in this case, no matter how many sessions on how many devices you have opened for that user, all of them will actually get the fact that, hey, that user is not authenticated anymore, and everything will actually change and behave accordingly. And yeah, I guess that's mostly it. If you made it this far, thank you really very, very much for watching. I hope that was some valuable information for you, because for me, when I found out these kind of like little tricks, actually changed a lot on how I was actually doing authentication or using authentication state in my Blazor server applications. And it also led me to the conclusions that I was doing that totally wrong. And hopefully from now on, you will also be able to do it on a better way, even if it is not the only right way, but surely it is a better way than what happens in 80–90% of all Blazor applications or tutorials that you might see online on how to get the authentication state. If you enjoyed that video and think that others might find it useful, please just spare a few minutes and share that with your peers, with your colleagues through email. I don't know, maybe even on Reddit or wherever you might think that you have a small community that might be interested of that. Please share that. And if you are not a subscriber, please just subscribe to this channel, but also make sure that you hit the notification bell button so that you get notified whenever we go online or whenever we have some new content. This being said, once again, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.